Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sadanand Dhume with the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for coming and welcome. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this event online, live. And I think people are going to keep trickling in as we speak, but we wanted to start exactly on time. Now, as many of you know, the Modi government was elected 2 years ago amidst great hope that it would radically overhaul and restructure the Indian economy, and it would embark upon the kinds of economics reforms that people had been talking about for a long time, but had in fact not been enacted until then. So the purpose of this panel is twofold. We want to assess the progress of the Modi government. How have they done on the economy over the past 2 years? And then we want to throw it forward and take a look and see where things are headed in the next 3 years and what we can reasonably expect. And I'm delighted to have this extremely distinguished panel here, some of the smartest people in Washington, D.C., or not in Washington, D.C., in the case of one person, to discuss this issue. You have their bios with you, so I will not go into detail over there. But we have on my right Kalpana Kochar. Next to her is Milan Vaishnav, then Vivek Dehejia, and Derek Scissors. So why don't I start with you, Kalpana?
Yeah. Thank you, Sadanand. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to be on this great panel with everyone. I'm sure it's going to be lots of interesting debates as we get along, just amongst us, let alone with you guys. So let me start with, I mean, as with everything in India, it's always a case of half empty and half full. So let me tell you a few areas where I see India where the glass is closer to being half full, and under this government. The first area I want to emphasize is subsidy reform and the use of the oil windfall. And India really, obviously the oil price decline has been a huge windfall for many countries, oil importing countries. But from where I sit at the IMF, we have the ability to see how lots of countries have dealt with this. And India really stands out as having used this oil price windfall in a very smart way. They used it, to deregulate fuel prices, so that fuel prices went down. They used it to increase excise taxes, which helped them get the fiscal deficit under control. They also used it to lower the subsidy bill. I mean, they got the fiscal deficit under control by raising excise taxes, so not passing through all of the decline. They also used it to lower subsidies. And so for the first time, you have the major subsidies of the government of India, totaling less than 2% of GDP in 2015 and 16. And frankly, I think the story on subsidies is going to be positive also going forward, because the government is finding ways to use the unique identification card to target subsidies, and therefore I think there's going to be quite a lot of waste and leakage that can be prevented. The second area where I see the glass as being closer to half full is FDI. India, some of you may or may not be aware, but there's been something of a resurgence of FDI inflows into India. It is not yet, obviously, in the same league as China, but it's very high, and in each year it's catching up. As a share of GDP, it's catching up. And it's going into, it seems to be pretty broad-based. It's going into services, but it's also going into computer and hardware services, but it's also going into construction services and a little bit into manufacturing. Less into manufacturing than probably should be the case, but I'll come back to that at the end. The third area is our structural reforms. The G20, the Group of 20 has made, all members of the Group of 20 have made pledges to do structural reforms. And the OECD assesses progress on these structural reforms. And then we can argue about whether this is the right assessment or not. But India scores very well on progress with structural reforms. You might think, so what exactly does that mean? The high scores are for the beginning of labor market reforms. It's true, it's not being done at the central government level. I think the government is being quite smart about this. Labor reforms are, and some of the other ones, are akin to the third rail. And I think what they've done is to push it down to the states, and many states are now, or a few states are now proceeding with these reforms. My own sense is they will succeed, and then they will slowly be emulated by other states. So Labor market reforms in Rajasthan and a couple of other states. Land reforms, what's happening, I think, in Tamil Nadu is probably instructive. So, again, it's a vast country and it's impossible to speak of structural reforms in the big picture, but I think it's very important. I think the Modi government is on to something by saying some of these things just do at the state level. It's not going to happen at the central level. The other big important structural reform is the bankruptcy code, which has just passed the Lok Sabha, which is and will hopefully be passed by the upper house in this session, but if not in the next session. The fact that it's been associated with the big case of Vijay Mallya and all the hoopla around that, I think probably raises the probability that it'll pass the upper house as well, because nobody wants to be associated with willful defaulters. The two areas where I see the glass as being closer to half empty is the GST, which has been cooking for a very long time. I mean, in various shapes or forms for more than 10 years. It's come close. I think the work done by Arvind Subramanian and his committee brings it close to being finished, but it's such a political hot potato that it's hard to see. And this is not necessarily the fault of the government, but I think some fancy footwork on the political side is going to be needed to get this done. The other area that I see as sort of half done is the whole corporate sector and the spillover onto the banking sector. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the asset quality, especially of public sector banks. The corporate sector in India is the parts of it that are quite heavily leveraged, and it's not clear how they're going to sort out that sector, because some of the industries in which there's the most distress are global overcapacity sectors, things like steel and cement and others, and many countries are grappling with this issue, and I'm India is not likely to be in the forefront. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about investment going forward until a good chunk of the corporate sector is able to clean up its balance sheet. And then two areas, finally, where I believe the glass is much less than half empty. And that is, I think we have to ask ourselves the question about whether India is doing enough to clean up and to become a much more vigorous trading nation. The trade regime has not undergone serious reforms in a very long time. I say this as in the context of regional trade agreements that are being signed, not necessarily because I believe that's the way to go, but because I believe they're more likely to lose further competitiveness without fixing the problems back home. And this doesn't mean they need to enter into a regional trading agreement, but there are trade issues that need to be dealt with. And the final one is the ownership of public sector banks. Let me just say that I don't know that a sector that's still 70% or so in the hands of the public sector is consistent with a modern growth model in India. So let me just leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Milan, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Sadanand, for hosting us, and it's great to be up here, as Kalpana said, with everyone else. Sadanand has been very strict about keeping us to 5 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. I think it's worth going back to the campaign in 2014 and thinking about what Modi's promise was to 1.2 billion Indians, which was to provide good governance and usher in a period of achhe din, right, good times, for the economy and for the livelihoods of India's population. 2 years in, I think the record is mixed. Now, I don't want to go over all the highlights because I do think there are many positive things that let's give credit where credit's due. I think it would be churlish to deny a lot of accomplishment. In two areas in particular, one is on the macro side. So if you think about 2 years ago when India was mentioned as being one of the countries among the fragile 5 emerging markets because of slowing growth, rampant inflation, high current account deficits, high fiscal deficits, on all 4 of those indicators, there's been a sea change from where India was 2 years ago. And you could argue whether or not that's due to propitious global conditions by way of low oil prices, but they're in power when the indicators are good, and so in my book, they should get credit for that. I think another place where they deserve some credit is on the investment climate. Kalpana mentioned the strong FDI numbers, the movement on the subsidy regime, and linking together subsidies with direct benefit transfers by way of Aadhaar, the biometric identification scheme. Natural resource auctions is another place, which again was a source of major scams with the previous government, the arbitrary ad hoc giveaways of coal and spectrum in particular. And of course, some modest progress on the ease of doing business, which I think certainly the government's intent seems to be in the right place. Okay, all of that is positive, so why do I say that the record thus far is mixed? So I think thus far the record is mixed because fundamentally in the first 2 years, the government has, in my view, failed to transform the historic relationship between the state and capital, which has been tilted in the direction of the former. Now, you could say it's only 2 years. How possibly could you have expected them to do all this in 24 months? My prognosis is that they're unlikely to do it in the remainder of their first term and looking forward, and I want to spend the rest of my time sketching out why. I think it's very popular to talk about the veto players that exist in Indian democracy and why it's hard for any government, even one with a single-party majority, to get its agenda through. And there's three things that get talked about a lot. One is the lack of control over the upper house, which again, this government has a historic mandate in the lower house, but it's a fragmented, deadlocked upper house. That's number one. The second is a lot of business is transacted through the states, of which the BJP only controls 8, and with its coalition partners, another 3 or so. It's still fewer than half of all of Indian states. That's number two. And number three is you have other institutions of accountability, whether it's the courts, whether it's the Auditor General. Just a few weeks ago, the judiciary raised the question about why the government wasn't ensuring that there was better flight connectivity to the city of Shimla. This is something that the government has to deal with because the courts can be quite activist. So we know about all of that. I think there are other internal obstacles within the government that prevent it from seeing through this agenda. I think one is Modi's own ambition. I think if you study the Gujarat model, and he sort of replicated that in the center, he's focused on two things. One is extracting greater efficiency from what the government does, and the second is building infrastructure. And I think both of those are very good things, but they don't equal what needs to be done in the policy reform agenda. And so therefore, there's not necessarily a clear vision about how you get a rebalance between state and private capital. And as a result, you see a lot of announcements, a lot of proclamations, and then often rollbacks or things sort of die down because it's not clear that courage of conviction at the very top layers in terms of what reforms India needs to pursue, what they look like, can be seen through. The third is the time horizon. This is somebody who feels he's going to be in power for at least 2 terms, if not more. So if you're thinking about what your agenda is going to be in 2024 to 2029, you may not necessarily need to rush through all of your reforms in the first couple of years. And the BJP is a big tent party. And remember, there are Ted Cruz's and Elizabeth Warren's in this party, right? So they span the entire spectrum from sort of the nativist, socialist left to the libertarian right. And so that makes it very difficult to navigate. So looking ahead, I hope I've stayed on time, Sadanand, and look forward to the conversation. What are the challenges? So I think Kalpana nailed some of them. I think one is I was surprised the extent to which the government did not act more swiftly when it came to dealing with this vice that's on the Indian economy right now, which is public sector banks, which are really hurting, and unable to lend, and the debt overhang that infrastructure companies are facing. Mm-hmm. And until you remove those two constraints, it's going to be very hard to get domestic investment going again. I think we're seeing that in continued slow investment, high degree of stalled projects. The second is they also have a fiscal challenge coming up. So they're trying to cut the deficit. They want to invest in infrastructure. They also have new obligations with respect to pensions and increased public sector salaries. Something's got to give. Now, the most natural something would be state assets, to divest of state assets and to use the proceeds of that to fund what they want to do on the fiscal side. We've seen very timid moves on this. A lot of talk, a lot of bluster, but very little implementation to date. And then let me just end talking about the social agenda. I think there's no question that there have been elements of the party and of the broader Sangh Parivar that have brought controversial social issues. The latest is this debate over who exactly is a national in India and who is anti-national, which have crowded out the economic agenda. Whether you believe in them or not, they've given ready ammunition to the opposition to obstruct what this government tries to do. So just from a strategic point of view, if you believe in reforms and you believe in this idea of fundamentally reshaping the Indian economy, there's a huge contradiction between your economic aspiration and your economic rhetoric and this kind of social divisions that sort of rhetoric introduces. And I think that's going to remain a huge challenge for the remainder of this government's term.
Thank you. Vivek.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to this. I mean, I'm going to suggest a somewhat different narrative. I mean, the sort of unstated assumption, and I think it was also perhaps even explicit in your intro, Sadanand, is that somehow what one was expecting, what we were told to believe, is some kind of sort of radical restructuring of the economy, or kind of a total rethink of the border between the market and the state, market and capital, or state and capital. And I think that one has set up thereby a totally unrealistic and frankly quite an unfair set of expectations surrounding it. So yes, it's true that Mr. Modi said maximum governance, minimum government, but he was campaigning. If we look at his, we're here in Washington at a very interesting time in your, politics. There's often a gap between what you say on the campaign trail and what you can actually do. But having said that, I think if one looks at Modi's track record in Gujarat, and I think that perhaps there's broad agreement here, that what one sees is a pattern of pragmatic modernization of the economy, making, for example, public sector units function better, not privatize them, make them function better, weed out corruption, weed out red tape, needless bureaucracy. And all of this one has seen Modi and the BJP doing at the center, with the wrinkle that India being a federal polity, the center can try and crack the whip on these things, and states may or may not fall in line. So, I mean, message one is that what one should have expected from Modi and the BJP is a pragmatic approach to modernizing the economy, fixing a broken public distribution system, weeding out corruption, and through Jan Dhan and so on, Aadhaar, they're trying to do that and doing a good job of it, I think. The second thing is this, that the other sort of unstated premise is, well, look, they're not doing enough in the way of structural reforms. And this is something that, that some of that we've all talked about. And here I also want to push back and say, look, so what do we mean by structural reform? So the first generation of reforms, as we all know, were reforms of product markets. So the Rao and Vajpayee reforms basically did away with the worst excesses of the license permit quota Raj, freed up product markets, freed up trade, freed up investment, the exchange rate, and so on. So second generation reforms are those of factor markets, land, labor, and capital. Well, guess what? The government actually has sincerely, I believe, tried to push all three of these. We all remember what now was turned out to be a failed attempt to reform the Congress's land acquisition law, poison chalice. They left the BJP, making it almost impossible to acquire land. Now that you can say in hindsight, perhaps that was the wrong fight to pick, but they had to pass it 3 times as an ordinance, and then finally gave up, couldn't get it through the RS. So anyone who says that they aren't trying to do structural reforms simply, has obviously effaced that from their memory. This was a valiant, ultimately failed attempt to reform the very flawed Land Act. Labor law, as I think we've said on this panel, Kalpana said, they have said, look, let's let the states do this. India is a federal state, a federal polity, and let's exploit that. Mm-hmm. Let reforms percolate out from the states, and reforms that are not acceptable now will be acceptable when a few states do it, and they see some fruits from those reforms. And lastly, Sadanand, capital market reforms. Now here, actually, quite a lot has been done. Bankruptcy law was mentioned. Monetary policy. I mean, India has now one of the world's most sophisticated monetary policy framework agreements that has an inflation target, an MPC that governs. In fact, the MPC will, I think, be set shortly after the finance bill makes its way through Parliament. Now, this is a pretty major reform. So couple this with bankruptcy reform, and you have the at least the inklings of a modern capital market and a bond market, which now doesn't exist, where a few brokers in Bombay won't control this very thin market. So all of these together, to me, suggests that the usual refrain that they aren't serious about structural reform is totally wrong. And if you look at the actual record, there's much to see as positive here.
Thank you. Derek.
I have learned already from my colleagues on the panel, and people say it all the time, I almost never say it. I usually just ignore my colleagues on the panel. So in this case, it's unusual. I can't talk to the Modi government and its critics, or if I can, I won't do as good a job, not only as my colleagues, but also a number of people in the room. So this is not about Indian political debates over the quality of economic policy. This is directed at some people in India, but also people in Washington, people around the world who think that India is transforming economically and is going to become a great global economic power. That is false. And I only have 5 minutes, so I can only hint at that, but I'll do it pretty quickly. This is not an attack on the Modi government. That depends on your expectations. It's not support of their critics. It depends on what they're criticizing for. Let's start off with GDP growth. So Indian GDP growth has held up better than a lot of parts of the world. And my response to that is, who cares? GDP growth is not a measure of prosperity. It's a measure of activity. You can bolster your GDP growth by merely engaging in unproductive transactions. Again, I only have 5 minutes. Let me give you a suggestion about this. According to Credit Suisse, so not my number, Indian wealth creation from mid-2014 and mid-2015 was flat. Total Indian wealth remained below that of Taiwan, population 23 million. As you know, if you don't want to use Credit Suisse numbers, use Indian government numbers. Average personal income is less than $2,000 a year. There's an attempt to adjust for purchasing power. The purchasing power adjustment is vastly overstated. Purchasing power parity relies on the law of one price, which due to transportation costs does not apply to most of Indian GDP. If you do adjust for purchasing power parity in a more reasonable way, you get purchasing power per income in India being less than $6,000. India is really, really far behind. I know all of you know that in the back of your mind. People who are making wild claims about India now as a global economic power know that, but they suppress those claims. So where is India going? Here's a point where I totally disagree with Vivek. Not the politics of the land bill failure. I don't know about those, and it seemed to me that his characterization was reasonable. The land bill that the Modi government was putting up was terrible. It wasn't that it failed, it was bad in the first place. What you want to do, if you want to transform India into moving it toward a rich country, is you don't want to make it easier for businesses to acquire land and for the government role to be sort of even more oppressive. You want to secure private rights to land. There are no rich countries where individuals do not have secure private rights to rural land. Not contested because we don't know where the boundaries are, not being able to take away from the government whenever they want to have development projects. So if you are trying to transform India into a rich country, the land bill that the Congress put up and the land bill that the Modi government put up are terrible land bills, whether they failed or succeeded. What we hear about India also, of course, and it's actually true, is that there's a demographic expansion, which is a wonderful opportunity for rapid growth and India become a truly global economic player. That's true. It's also true that demographic expansion can be a curse. And we see this in the Arab world. What you want to do in this case is you want to integrate the very small formal labor market and with the very large informal labor market and create a very large mobile formal labor market. There is progress being made, as some of my colleagues have stated. It is extremely slow. Demographic expansions don't last forever. And in fact, they're followed by demographic busts. And as time ticks away on we're going to do it state by state. And again, this is not a political attack. I don't know what the politics are well enough. And it seems to me reasonable to say the Modi government isn't on the hook for solving all of India's economic problems. What I'm telling you is you can't just say, well, in 15 years, we're going to have a decent labor market. Well, you've blown most of the demographic expansion at that point. You don't get to say we're having a demographic expansion and 15 years from now we'll be able to take advantage of it and act like that both things are happening at the same time. So the last point, because I really do want to stick to 5 minutes, and I figure I've offended enough people, certainly Vivek.
I do want to respond on the
Don't let him respond. Go directly to questions.
1 minute.
And the last thing is, and I've mentioned this before in print, there's this magnificent inconsistency from macroeconomic development perspective between not just this government, the previous government, really all Indian governments that all want to brag about how fast they're growing and how India is outperforming the world, but they can't get the deficit under control. And the Modi government's going to say, we're getting the deficit under control better than the previous government. Hooray. Why is there a deficit at all? If you really are growing this quickly, you should not be borrowing money. And the answer is India is wasting an enormous amount of capital compared to its actual capital stock. So you're not taking advantage of the labor expansion. You're not getting the productivity from land because you're not assigning land rights, and you're wasting capital. That's it. That's the cap on India's economic performance. I'm not in a position politically to determine whether this is going to change. I can only tell you that right now, this is not about the Modi government. It's about people saying India is going to become a leading economic power and is this dynamo transforming itself and leading the world in economic growth. That's just a false characterization.
So I know that both Vivek and Kalpana are chomping at the bit to get to, but I'm going to start with Vivek on land.
Just a minute,
and then
really,
Kalpana on India's prospects.
Yeah, just a minute on this. See, Derek, the point is that this land bill didn't just come out of the blue. They just woke up saying, let's reform the land law. They inherited a very flawed law from the Congress, which made land acquisition absolutely impossible. So what they proposed was something of a compromise between the old law, the old inherited colonial era law, where the government could acquire anything, and the Congress's law, which made it impossible. It was a compromise. And yes, you have to get the private market involved. And guess what? That's also happening. Land titling is a huge project. Rajasthan has now unveiled a whole system, kind of classic De Soto thesis, give people title to their land, and then the market will function. And that is happening. Just very quickly on the fiscal deficit, the actual real debate in India is not 0 versus 3.9 or whatever it is, but it's do we loosen or do we stick to the target? And they stuck to the target. So in the relevant context, they actually took a fairly hawkish position on the fiscal deficit.
Now, my understanding of the land thing is that, yes, of course, it would be better if you had reliable, transparent, private title. But if the option is between the government being able to acquire land, so, for instance, for development purposes, eminent domain or no eminent domain under the present circumstances is a second best option, but it is better than what we have in the law.
I'll wait for Kalpana, and then I'll tell you why you're all wrong.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into the land debate, although I'm much closer to Vivek's side of the argument than Derek's. Yeah, I'm very puzzled by this statement that India shouldn't have a budget deficit. What does that mean? I mean, this is a country. Look, I don't know how far back you want to go in history, but this is a country that is still actually very poor. You're right, the gap is huge. By the way, when you have a gap from the frontier, it's a positive or a negative. When there's a force called convergence, which drives poorer countries towards the frontier, so that will happen much more in India than, I don't know, Taiwan. But on the budget deficit, I'm really kind of puzzled. I mean, it's true they don't collect enough revenue for their level of development. You draw a line with per capita income and you put all the countries on it. India collects less revenue than it should. Nobody's arguing with that. There have been valiant attempts made, not just by this. Again, this transcends Modi government and all the other governments. The GST, I believe, will be a transformational law in that regard, but there's huge holes in the income tax system. They just recently published statistics on how many people actually pay taxes in India. Ridiculously low. So that has to be fixed. But that is not going to eliminate the budget deficit. I think there we're getting to the issue that Milan raised about the balance between the state and private capital. The state has to be involved in many advanced countries, including here. The state was involved in the early parts of development, and then the private sector took over. I have doubts. I'm not going to argue that it's going to be seamless. I've already made my point about a large part of the financial system being in public sector hands, and notwithstanding changes in governance and this and that, I don't believe that that's actually a model that's going to serve India well going forward.
But Kalpana, what about the point he raised about the demographic dividend, and if you go too slow, you miss it?
And that's a possibility. But you also said demographic curse, as in the Middle East. There's a big difference between India and the Middle East. So I mean, there's a huge, still very dynamic private sector in India that's doing as well as it's doing, despite all the obstacles that are in the way, and that will continue. And I don't believe it'll take 15 years for the states to do their reforms. That's not how it works. I think once success begins to be established, there will be, I think, a race to the top.
Derek.
So, I mean, again, I'm not talking about how the Modi government does versus the previous government. I'm not interested in this issue, and I don't know enough about it to compete with my colleagues and a number of people in the room. I think this might come down to the things that have been said so far, a disagreement over the proper role of the state. You see, well, what else should India do besides run a budget deficit? I say, I don't know, have the government stop wasting money, which is what the Indian government does. It wastes a ton of money. If we want to argue about that I can do. You want to say, look, and Sadhnan echoed the point, eminent domain is better than not the state not being able to acquire land. No, what's better is if the central government in India actually pushes toward actively in a land bill the ability of private land markets to work, which was not the point of that land bill at all. And you say, well, they couldn't have gotten that through. Well, they didn't get they didn't get the lousy one through either. I'd rather have them fail with something good that sets up an improvement in land markets. And again, I'm not talking about Modi being better or worse than the Congress government. I'm talking about the foundations for an actual transformation of the Indian economy, and they aren't being realized. And maybe they can't be realized. And this is the government's been careful to manage expectations. It's not about them failing to deliver on their election promises. That's not the argument I'm making. It's about, I'm speaking to people in India, but also people in Washington who expect an India that isn't going to exist on its current policy path.
Milind.
I mean, I just want to sort of step back 1 second and think about the broader debate. I mean, Vivek sort of mentioned that, look, we have to set our expectations at the right level, sort of insinuating that, sort of Pollyannish to think that this prime minister could fundamentally transform this relationship. Now, I think we have to start with first principles, right? I mean, you're the economist, I'm not the economist, which is to say, what do we think needs to be done when we think about macro and micro policy in India, right? And what were the promises and the rhetoric which were used in the campaign, which were vague, I'll grant you that, but in line with this idea that I need to administer bitter medicine to the people of India. I need to, the business of government is not to be in business, that we need to have maximum governance, minimum government, right? All of these things are pushing that direction. Now, many of us had written at the time that he wasn't going to do these things, both because of his own internal political constraints, as well as the other veto players that dot the Indian landscape. But I don't see any reason why we shouldn't hold the government's feet to the fire for what we think, needs to be done at this broader perspective, right? Rather than just say, well, he's not going to do that, so let's just, fight the incrementalist battle. Now, if you want to fight the incrementalist battle, which is fair enough, you have to ask, is the government doing all it can do on the incrementalist battle? Now, I think there's two problems, right? One is the social side, which I mentioned. A lot of distraction is coming in, which is going to take away and has taken away from pushing the economic agenda. And we've seen that in the way Parliament's been disrupted on a number of issues. But the second is, even if you want to take the incremental agenda on economic terms alone, there are a number of low-hanging fruit items which the government hasn't done. So I just want to mention, if I have a couple of minutes, a few of them. So last year, the Minister of State for Finance announced that India would be setting up an independent debt management agency and taking that away from the Reserve Bank of India, which many experts think is a conflict of interest. 2 days later, when the finance bill was tabled, that provision mysteriously dropped out without any explanation. One of the first promises in the first Modi budget, 6 weeks after they came in power, was they were going to set up an expenditure management commission to look at the range of government expenditures and come up with smart ways of rationalizing them. 2 reports have come out from this commission, and neither of them are allowed to even go on a government website. Okay. There have been rumors of the government banning foreign direct investment in tobacco. and foreign licensing in tobacco products. The ultimate beneficiary of that is going to be domestic companies who are have significant ownership from other public sector companies, right? And so you can sort of go on the list and say, okay, let's even just go with the incremental agenda. Why is it that there's so much stop and start, right? There is a lot of either the left hand doing one thing and the right hand doing something else, or contradictions within the government that I think need to be resolved.
Vivek.
Yeah, thanks. And I just need, I would like to push back on a few of these points. And I suppose there's a bit of an irony here, Milan, that you are, I'm the economist and the university professor, but you're making a very academic argument here that we have to judge Modi and the BJP by some abstract first principles of what we would like them to do. Well, that's not how politics works. Politics is the art of the possible, the art of the feasible. And there are some very good reasons why it is simply politically infeasible, politically unwise, plain dumb for Modi and the BJP to push more aggressively than they are. For one thing, let's look at the land bill, which we can come back to. Now, that was a sincere attempt to push a fairly aggressive reform, which backfired on them politically. Now, that gave them some feedback, right? There are a whole range of reasons. Now, you've actually written on this. You have scholarly work on this. There is perhaps now some emerging evidence that in recent years, good economics does help help incumbents win re-election. But that evidence is far from certain, and politicians, at the end of the day, would like to get re-elected. Now, I have yet to see any kind of a credible data-based analysis by anyone on this table or anyone else to prove to me or suggest to me why exactly Modi should risk losing re-election in 2019 to push some preferred, policy wonks reform agenda. Someone sitting in Washington or New York or London or somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But that's a totally. It would be like someone in Bombay saying to Washington, look, forget the politics. This is what the White House or Congress should be doing. It makes no sense whatsoever. So incrementalism is the reality of politics in India. And also, guess what? This is something that goes back to my doctoral work at Columbia. Gradualism and incrementalism works everywhere. Shock therapy and radical reforms very, very rarely ever work. And you only ever get radical transformations or big bang in time of a crisis. Latin America, Africa, 91, India, 91. But otherwise, it doesn't work. And there's no persuasive evidence, Pache, Jeffrey Sachs, that actually Big Bang has worked anywhere. Perhaps it worked in Poland, which is a bit of a special case. In Russia, there was enormous blowback. The attempt to reform that economy too quickly led to the entire collapse of that system. So the reality is, we can talk about first principles, or we can talk about the actual reality of politics in India, which is if you're moving forward incrementally, at least you're moving in the right direction. And you cannot, to try and turn around the whole ship around, and if you've capsized the ship, then you're much worse off than before.
So, Vivek, let me push back on that. First of all, I think this idea that Big Bang versus incrementalism, I think it's a bit of a straw man to argue that anyone thought that he would be doing something, like post-Soviet Russia, right? What the expectations or what is called Big Bang in an Indian context is in fact very little bang.
Well,
it's very modest, and let me give you examples.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but anyway,
I'll give you some examples. Okay. The expectations that have not been met have been things like roll back the retroactive tax, which most people agree was the single worst measure any government has passed in 25 years. This government did not do that. Don't privatize everything, but privatize some real dogs. Scooters India, Hindustan photo films. Yeah. So these are we could go on. Subsidies, it's been good in terms of percentage of GDP. But again, in terms of what has been a reform agenda for India that all of us have been talking about for 10 years or 15 years or longer, which is a modest agenda, which is already something which is bound by the politics. No one in India is talking about completely a blank slate. So for instance, when we talk about land, we look at the realities of titling. Mm-hmm. That's why I disagree with Derek's point there.
Right.
So I guess, to me, this whole idea that people were calling for things that were so radical or so unimaginable, simply isn't true.
Well, I would actually, in fact, strongly disagree with that. I mean, if one reads what was being written 2 years ago, there was a sense that somehow there'll be a radical transformation of the relationship of market and the state. And that clearly was totally unrealistic. Now, when you say that what we're looking for is not even Big Bang, well, actually, if you look at what second-generation structural reforms are, which are factor markets, they actually are trying to do those. So yes, I mean, they could privatize a few more, PSUs.
Few more than zero.
The ones you mentioned would be largely tokenism. PSU banks, now this is something that Kalpana also raised, this is now not the time. No, yes, you could have done it 2 years ago when when the banks were in better shape. Now is not the time to do it, right? The banks basically, this would be a dumb time to privatize the banks. At some point, I agree, when they're back to some semblance of health, maybe you're going to collect all the bad debts into a bad bank of some kind and then trying to sort it out, but now isn't the time.
Yeah.
Milind, then Derek, then Kalpana.
No, I mean, I think, Sadanand, I think, largely sort of clarified what I was going to say. But look, I mean, there is a fundamental law of political economy which works in most democracies everywhere, which is you have a window of opportunity. You could say it's 12 months, you could say it's 16 months, but early on, where you try to do a few big things, because inevitably politics reverts to the mean, and you start to think about your next election. And I think, as you just said, they could have done the banks 2 years ago, right? We could have come up with 2 or 3 things which many people are writing about and many people are talking about and saying, if you do these 2 or 3 things early on, that is going to pay huge dividends, and you have the political capital. Now, I think what's unusual about Modi as a political phenomenon is that he has a very different hypothesis about how political capital works. He thinks that it's an appreciating asset, that he can gain and store it and it'll accumulate over time and he'll be even stronger down the line. Now, typically in most democracies, that's not, certainly in this one where we're sitting today, it's not how it works, right? Now, ultimately, we'll see whether he's right or the experts are right. But I do think that that's a fundamental point that we can't sort of escape, that there is a window, that window is gone, and other political forces start to churn.
Derek and then Kalpana.
Well, Kalpana, you're probably right on topic. I'm a little bit off topic.
Okay, Kalpana first.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I have to pick up on some of these points. That first of all, I completely agree that somehow attributing objectives for his government and then saying they didn't meet them, that's obviously completely unfair. But I do have to say, what is the strategy? You have big slogans. Let me just say, Make in India is a big slogan. You have done some things, you are starting to do, and I was the one who pointed out land and labor reforms, business environment. How do you make in India when you have a completely dysfunctional trading system? I mean, seriously, that to me, the disconnect, he came up with that slogan, not anybody else. So is someone sitting there and saying, what do we need to do to make this Make in India thing happen? And I think that for me, there is the disconnect. And nobody's saying there's going to be a big transformation in 2 years between state and private capital, although people did think that the BJP government was going to be much closer to doing that than the Congress government was. But then the only other point I wanted to take up was on the PSBs and when is a good time to deal with public sector banks. I'm sorry, you just cannot say, it's 2 years ago was not a good time, now it's not a good time. I mean, this is an economy. Why is it a good time? They have, as you said, well-functioning, much better functioning capital markets now, including the stock market. You have a vibrant private sector banking system growing, and if you give them more space, they'll probably take that space. Why is this not the right time to privatize? There are some real dog banks there, and if they know it. So all I want to say, I'm not saying it should happen overnight. That is obviously very disruptive. But have you seen a strategy? Have you heard a hint of a strategy for how they're going to take this forward that actually says the government being in ownership is not compatible with the modern economy going forward?
Derek.
I'm desperately sidelining myself from the Indian political discussion, which is not to say that it's not vital.
This is about Modinomics.
I know, but it's not Modi politics or whatever. It's the Modinomics, and so I'm talking about sort of whether the economic plan would be successful if it was actually implemented, which I do not think it would be, which is in my mind, a more fundamental challenge than the implementation of it. But one thing that I think I can hook on the politics, and Kaman already brought it up, at home, and Vivek's an excellent defender of this view, you get a lot of it's not feasible. But when you ask India, as I have, ask Indian policymakers, you are going to have the world's biggest labor force, and it's going to be young at the same time. You should be leading trade liberalization. That is an opportunity for your labor force to serve the world, in particular richer markets, bring in income. You should be leading on this. No. We don't like, the spread of plurilateral regimes. We want to work with the WTO. Wait. At home, you have to be reasonable and political. But when things are actually happening overseas, you pretend that, I don't like that. That's not the right way to proceed. Too bad. This is what's happening. So what India should be doing, consonant with Make in India, consonant with demographic expansion, consonant with any reasonable trajectory for India to rise strongly, would be to lead on trade. And we don't get that. And that's not a function, it may be very well, I shouldn't say that. It may very well be a function of domestic political constraints. But some of the same people, not up on the panel, some of the same people who tell me that I don't appreciate, which I don't, the extent of restraint domestically are really unrealistic about India's international trade footprint, how its partners treat it, and what's going to happen in the absence of a much more proactive Indian trade policy.
Vivek, why don't you?
Can I?
Trade part.
Yeah, no, I will. I want to speak to that. But just briefly, if I may, on Milan's point about window of opportunity, look, this is a classic Jeffrey Sachs argument that has been proven to be wrong. This notion that you have to act quickly, the laws of normal politics. Well, perhaps it's true in some places, certain times, but it's not a general law of political economy at all. You can have the opposite problem, which is you try too much, and there's backlash, there's blowback, and then you've blown all your political capital, and you can't do anything. And I think that is certainly, again, look, Modi is a very successful politician. And I think no one will debate that. And I think he's calculated that he has to calibrate the way he rolls out reforms at the pace at which he does it. There are several reasons, and we all know them on this table, so I won't spend too much time. But there's a lot of baggage and history in India of the sense that excessive enthusiastic economic reform carries heavy political costs. Now, 2004, it's the wrong lesson, but the lesson stuck that India's shining was what led the BJP NDA-1 to defeat. Now, we know, in fact, that is not in fact, empirically the case. It's factually wrong. It was, they lost Andhra. It was a bad coalition, bad partner choice, DMK and so on. But that somehow stuck. That baggage has stuck with every major political party, and therefore there's going to be inbuilt caution. You don't want a repetition of NDA-1 where you go like gangbusters, and they say, "Hang on a second, now we've lost the election in 2019."
But maybe that's smart politics, but is that the best thing for the economy?
Well, see, those are two different questions. There's some optimal, some ideal out there in the universe, which may or may not be feasible politically. So my view is, if you push incrementally closer to the optimal situation, that's better than not doing anything, or better than trying too hard, having blowback, having pushback, and then falling backward. So that'd be my view on that. I think on the trade policy, I did want to speak to this because, I certainly share the general aspiration that India must articulate a coherent strategic trade policy stance. I strongly disagree that we have to play ball with TPP and so on, all these other, but that's all that's out there. Well, if the only choice is between a bad deal, a Trojan horse deal that kills your pharma industry because, US-style IPP is imposed on India, no thanks. I've written on this, that, India is in a tough situation. India should be liberalizing unilaterally. I think there you and I would, agree, Kalpana. But signing up to a bad agreement is worse than no agreement at all. So, it's not an easy spot to be in. India doesn't have the heft politically, to spearhead a major regional or preferential agreement. WTO process seems to be moribund. So I would say get your act together domestically. There are all kinds of stuff you can fix domestically that won't involve. And this notion, this idea that somehow signing up to something like TPP can goad domestic reform may be true in some other countries. It's certainly not true in India. In India, if anything, there would be a backlash. that, oh, this is being imposed from Washington or, wherever else, and people will push back on that much more aggressively. So I think fix your domestic trade policy regime and work towards a fair multilateral system. Do not be bullied by the U.S. into signing up for a bad agreement that brings in a whole bunch of non-trade stuff under the, masquerading as trade. It's not trade. Beyond the border is code for, we'll go and change your domestic policies, domestic laws, domestic regulation. No, thank you.
Derek.
Vivek, I don't know about the rest of it. That is a total straw man. Bullied by the U.S. The U.S. doesn't want India in TPP. The U.S. may not want TPP, period. You are setting up a characterization where other people are at India's door hoping to impose rules on them. People have largely given up on trying to get India to be a good trade partner.
That's maybe a good thing.
Okay, all right. Well, then that's your answer. The answer is not, our only options are a bad trade deal or nothing.
Well,
hold on.
I've got a response to that one.
In RCEP, I get wave after wave of India's RCEP partners saying they're the biggest troublemaker in RCEP, okay? Now, RCEP isn't the U.S. bullying and beyond border or any U.S. deals, but more to the point, you're absolutely right. India is a big country. Big countries should always fix their own economies first before turning to trade. But that gets back to, if I start talking to you about changes in the trade regime, as Kapana has mentioned, you'll say, well, it's politically infeasible or whatever. So India's not going to fix its domestic trade regime. What I want from India is not that magical success. I want them to step forward and say, we have to be a trade leader because of our labor situation, because of our stage of development. We don't like the TPP, so we're going to lead in a different way. What we get from India, though, in terms of all of its partners' reactions, is you are the most uncooperative major player in the world.
Well, let me just bring this back to politics for a second. I mean, if I get Vivek properly, I guess what we're saying is that a government with the first single-party majority in 30 years doesn't get to do much and has to be extremely cautious because whatever it does is... So does that just mean that we step back and say, well, let's reassess the path India is on?
Yeah, I guess I sort of disagree with that premise, right? I mean, I think what we were talking about of the kinds of things that could be done in the first 12 months, it's not, a sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite. I mean, I realize we're at AI, but, this is...
We wish.
We're talking about a government committee which has said it would be good if maybe reduced government and ownership of PSU banks to 51%, not even privatized, right? I mean, we're talking about moving the needle in a direction that would be positive in this overall balance between state and capital, right? So I think that's one. I mean, I think a second thing is, Vivek said it before, they learned, it was the wrong lesson from 2004, right? I think there is a emerging body of evidence which says that good economics does make for good politics, right? And lots of people have looked at the data and come up with a similar conclusion. I think the thing about, obviously politics is important, right? As a political scientist, it'd be foolish to sort of overlook the politics. But you also have to take smart, calculated political risks. My beef with the land bill, and many people were writing it at the same time, many people were advocating this position in the cabinet, was you should not go for a law. Number one, this is a Congress party, this is a pillar of their legacy. So the moment you try to knock it out, there's going to be massive political opposition. And the second is the bill was so poorly drafted by the previous government that just in the rulemaking and notifications alone, you could get 80 to 85% of what you wanted, right? So that's actually an example of where I think it was actually a bad political risk. It would have been much better to do it at the state level from the beginning and use those chits on something else. And it may sound like ex post rationalization, but many people were writing it and saying it at the time. Many people within the Rural Development Ministry, which was looking at this, were advocating that position at the time. So I think, one of the big surprises for me when you look out at the landscape and say, as a chief minister, as a former chief minister, Modi has actually been somewhat reluctant to sort of map out a strategy for BJP states. I would have thought, if I were him, I would have said, okay, what would the elements of a common minimum program look like for BJP states? We now have more than we've ever had. They're nearly all geographically contiguous, right? Could we create some kind of economic zone? And let's let's lead by example, and the others will realize that the steps that we're taking on land and labor and so on are beneficial, and then they're going to be forced to emulate. Now, what he's doing is an improvement, which is letting states come to him and say, we want to tweak this law, will you give a central assent? But that's a very different thing from actually leading from the top and saying, these are the 6 or 8 things I think BJP states should be doing. And my hand-picked chief ministers, who I put into place in many of these states, let's work together and get this done.
Actually, the state question is interesting, and it comes back to something that you raised in your comments, Kalpana, which is that some of the reforms have simply been kicked to the states, land, labor to a certain degree. And I think Milind is right that he's pointed out that you see some action in some states, but really not that much. But what does that mean for us as people who look at the reform process in India? So, I mean, does this just mean that anything tough now has to just be sort of piecemeal, and the idea of the national government driving big reform is not on the table?
No, I mean, obviously there will be some, I mean, the PSU bank strategy, that's not a state matter. It has to be a central matter whenever it's tackled.
Bankruptcy.
Trade. I mean, trade, just to be clear, there was a big wave of trade reforms, obviously, in 91, but there's a lot of issues on logistics, and this has nothing to do with anybody imposing anything on India. This really is about moving goods from where they're produced to where they need to be shipped and then put on a ship and out onto, So, I mean, we can talk about the logistical issues, and that's what I think needs to be fixed. So, no, there are some matters that are in the federal government's hands, and I think the whole financial sector, the whole trading regime, dealing with the corporate sector, so certainly if you go back to the way Vivek characterized it, the factor market reform, land and labor, probably state matters, capital, federal, central matter.
Vivek, I want to come back to something that before this event I was just going over some of your columns, and I was struck by how your position has evolved, and I'm sort of curious to see what's driving that. So let me just quote a few things. In August last year, you said the government is, quote, paying but lip service.
I was sure you would dig out this particular column.
And then suddenly, in March this year,
Not suddenly.
you're like, all the people who say that he should be reforming more are some evil Washington think tank conspiracists.
I'm not exactly saying that.
More or less. Yeah. So what changed?
No, I'll tell you. I mean, my own thinking on this, of course, our thinking evolves as the facts on the ground change. I think when I wrote that particular piece, I think it was August.
Right.
There was a sense that perhaps there was a loss of focus, a loss of thinking about pushing the reforms agenda. But after that, a whole bunch of things happened. I mean, and we've talked about them here: the financial sector reforms, bankruptcy, labor law starting at the level of the states, and so on, being strong, sticking to the fiscal deficit target. So, my own sense, and perhaps I myself, have now taken a more realistic view of what's feasible and what's practical. Look, after all, I'm an economist. I would love for a whole bunch of reforms to happen, today or overnight. But increasingly my sense is that politically it is much more difficult, it is much more intractable. Political capital can be quickly dissipated. And, back on this question, this point that you raised, Milind, the notion that good economics is good politics, yes, your research in particular suggests that this might be increasingly be the case. But I think to be fair, the jury is still out. There are, other papers out there that show that if you pick only the large states, that it seems to be mostly random. The truth is, we don't really know what wins elections. As economists, we would love to think that good economics will drive good, will be rewarded by the voters, because that would lead to a good outcome. But the truth is, we don't know that. So I guess perhaps that August column was a moment of frustration on my part. Look, why aren't these guys doing more? And my thing is now, look, I think they're doing what they can. I think Modi has figured out, he's calibrated. Look, this is how much I can push on this. This is what I have to push down to the states. And again, to the point that you raised, Milind, there are two models. The center can lead, saying, look, you guys, I got you elected. You're my hand-picked chief ministers, BJP states. You do X, Y, and Z. But having now once been elected, they are now, somewhat autonomous. They can tell Modi to, go wherever, because they are going to have a free hand in their state, at least for the next 5 years that they're in power. So I think, again, and this fits the fact that Modi, came to the center as a chief minister. It's much more effective, it seems to me, politically, just in terms of psychology and common sense. It's like, you guys, you know your state better than we do from, sitting in Delhi. What do you need? And again, I want to just highlight one thing. I mean, there's a lot being done behind the scenes. I mean, Niti Aayog, much maligned, I think wrongly, maligned in the press. One of its, the two hats it wears, so having been shorn of its, of its financial or its budgetary role, it is supposed to be a think tank for the union, right? And also the friend of the states at the center. And the second part, which almost no one is talking about, actually is a very important piece of Niti's work, where they go down to the states, they go to all the states, and look, how can we help you with whatever reform agenda you guys want to pursue? We have the expertise and the capacity. We aren't coming, with bags of money anymore, right? But we can help you sort this out. On the ease of doing business in particular, I mean, Niti, and this is something that I'm actually involved with very directly, is we're doing a survey of all of the, all states of the union, do an on-the-ground assessment, talk to enterprises. Look, what are the actual problems you guys face? Is it acquiring land? Is it law and order? Is it, infrastructure? What are the problems you guys face? And then create a kind of a thematic approach to help each state fix the problems that are most pressing there. And this, so again, I mean, I do believe, there are all kinds of slogans in elections, but fiscal federalism, or just, federalism in general, is, to me, is not a slogan for Modi. I mean, as someone who came from a state, he genuinely believes that let's exploit India's federal polity and empower the states. And, the U.S. is a good example of a country, or Canada, where reforms that are just impossible to do from top down become feasible. I mean, in this country, for instance, a topic like gay marriage was unthinkable to be pushed by the feds. Well, it happened at the states, and now it's a federal law, I believe. Or legalizing pot. I mean, these are kind of social policy examples in the U.S. Well, in India, labor law, and land are fit this whole template.
Derek, you had a two-finger?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, Vivek and I think, disagree sharply on trade, but not necessarily on anything else. In fact, I could take his position entirely, and it supports mine, because I'm not attacking Modi. All I want you to get is take what Vivek is taking seriously, believe most of it, whatever. The implication for people in the U.S. especially, maybe not people in this room, maybe this room is too well informed for this, but for the broader American debate, the implication is you're not going to get the change in India that you're hoping. And you're in New York. I'm already getting Wall Street types calling me saying, oh, you were right, China's slowing. India, right? India will be great. Let's go to India. And it's a very superficial argument about if you could do anything you want, India would have this kind of economic trajectory. And all I'm saying is that isn't going to happen at all. And Vivek is he may not want to be associated with me. That's a different story.
I want to be. You're my friend.
You're actually partners in this. I am taking exactly what he's saying and saying we're going to be moved way off the ideal economic trajectory. And economic expectations for India have to be adjusted among those people who were perhaps extremely unrealistic a couple of years ago.
Kalpana, why don't you take that first, and then Milan?
I'm not going to argue again about whether they fulfilled expectations. I really do think I'm much more with Derek on look at India's what it faces, and this is not about Modi. Obviously, the demographics have been trained for a long time, but it is coming to a head. We're now at 1 million people joining the labor force every month. Mm-hmm. That's a frightening number, and so for me, I do see. I have acknowledged in the beginning that there are important changes going on. I am personally very worried about whether it's going with enough of a strategy. I still think that land and labor have to go, the way that they're doing it, and I don't believe it'll take 15 years. But I do want something of an articulation saying this is how we see the country evolving to deal with this, to turn what we have into a dividend.
Milan, I want to come back to something you wrote in Foreign Affairs, in fact, called Modinomics at 2, which we We shamelessly stole the title for our event.
Also, my recent column, I think, shamelessly stole that title.
So, where you said, I quote you, the challenge for Modi, therefore, is to use his considerable political capital to convince the electorate, not to mention skeptics within his own party, that pro-poor and pro-market are two sides of the same coin. How does he do that?
Maybe I should be at AEI, right? That sounds pretty.
We just picked the stuff we like.
Kidding. Look, let me just stipulate, and I didn't say enough at the beginning, because Kalpana covered that, is that this government has done a fair amount. I think one can make solid incremental progress, but I think there's an argument, and I think maybe this is where the GDP numbers have fed into this, that we're going to have the last laugh come 2018 because growth is going to be at 8, inflation is going to be at 4, the fisc is going to be under 3, and the current account deficit is going to be maintained. Now, even if you stipulate the global conditions stay the same, right? The jobs issue is a huge issue, right? And we're seeing state after state agitations around the issue of reservations. So people who are actually fighting to be classified as backward to avail themselves of reservations, of government jobs which are a shrinking pie, right? So there is a sense in which I feel like maybe this government doesn't have the same kind of urgency that it should, right? And then that's where I think Modi's political capital could be sort of deployed. And the point I wanted to make at the outset is it's well and good to talk about political obstacles that are out there, and they are there and they're significant. But at the end of the day, we have to come back to the fact that many of the biggest political obstacles are actually inside of the tent rather than outside of the tent, right? And the way in which the government has or has not been able to manage the RSS, right, has implications for the economic agenda. You quoted somebody in your recent column saying, this is not so much a BJP government supported by the Indian Administrative Service, the IAS, but an IAS government supported by the BJP, right? So the way in which they've been able to manage the bureaucracy. And so I think, I do think at some point these things are going to come to a head.
I think it's time to open it up to questions. If you could just identify yourself and keep it short and a question, and also make sure that the mic reaches you before you... gentleman over there.
Tom Timberg, consultant. This is really a question for everybody, but I suspect both Vivek and Milan will be the primary respondents.
One person, because we want to get more out.
Okay, but you're the guest.
Which one, you should decide which one wants to do it. You've been talking about all the policy changes, but there's a strong school of thought that argues that more important than individual policies are the perceived responsiveness of the government to the concerns of businessmen. In fact, Arvind Subramanian himself had an article which he did with Danny Roderick, which argued that the whole post-liberalization experience was not so much a response to particular policy changes, which after all occurred somewhat later, but a more generally open pro-business response. So the question is, to what extent has there been the change there? And the point that that Milan has made recently about the fact that though foreign direct investment has increased, domestic investment has decreased, whether that is connected with a situation where big foreign companies can perhaps get access to the government and get a case-by-case change, but domestic investors cannot.
Milan, do you want to take a crack at that?
I think the distinction that Danny Roderick and Arvind made in the piece was, if you look at many of the changes that the government of India made in the 1980s, they were more pro-business than pro-market, right? And the pro-market changes came more in 1991. I think the question facing this government is this government pro-business or pro-market? And I wouldn't say it's unambiguously pro-market. I think it's closer to the pro-business camp, right? Where, I think we conceptualize Modi as somebody who's a modernizer, not necessarily a liberalizer. So, yes, he has taken steps on foreign direct investment, but he's fallen short of things that would be truly transformational on, say, lifting FDI caps, for instance. In many instances, and the PSUs are a good example, right? He seems uninterested in divesting of those resources, but rather sort of making them work better, right? And so I think, I think he seems to be on that spectrum closer to that end than the other. I don't know if Vivek.
Just one word, if I may, on this. I mean, the tightrope that Modi or any Indian government, or any government anywhere has to walk is between being pro-business and being captured, right? Crony capture, corruption, and in a sense, ironically, the last government was very pro-business, but it was too pro-business because it was captured. You had all of these huge corruption scams. So I mean, ironically, Modi has kept big business at arm's length. And that's why, whatever else you may say of this government, there's been not a whiff of any kind of a corruption scam. This is, perhaps the lowest corruption regime we've actually had, and that comes from keeping from having cut those ties with the cronies.
This lady here in the table in front, right here.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. After hearing all this TPP, well, maybe you want to talk about this World Bank or IMF, I would really think a lot of time a country will be pressured to do something that is really against best interest of general public. And when I think you would talk about reform, what I didn't really understand, so what kind of reform, a really positive or just a misleading? So I just wonder, is it really for, I don't know whether India now is a total capitalism or something else. I know previously you have a very good culture. It's really should be appreciated and it should be maintained. And currently you are thinking maybe a lot of Asian countries, they are thinking of high skyscraper, but that does not really mean you preserve your social culture. That is very dangerous.
Okay,
and
I think we got it.
And France...
just let her answer that.
I have priority. I want you to discuss whether you really have informed the voters to have voting rights, and whether they really have a good democracy rather than just pro-business. That is misleading. So I just wonder if you can really have some good reform, have a maintenance, a good candidate forum, have a good debate, rather than a lot of misleading. In America, there is no real debate. They have a lot of
ma'am,
phone.
That's enough.
You've got to let
Thank
someone else answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to take a crack at that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Just maybe quickly to say, we've been sitting here debating all sorts of things, but all of us, I think, believe in the end it has to do with the Indian citizen. And the Indian citizen, and maybe the number that Derek quoted at the beginning, either per purchasing power parity or not, India has a long way to go, and any government owes its citizens a much better standard of living. So in the end, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about jobs, and we're talking about better standards of living. So I don't, everything else is noise around that. So,
Aparna?
Hi, I just had a question. So we've been seeing big changes in labor force participation. You mentioned, Derek, the more younger workers coming into the market. You see that around you. My friends are getting jobs at great multinationals and so on. Why does that not translate into higher tax revenues? I mean, why do we still have the statistic that only about 1% of the population is paying taxes or federal income taxes? And, do you see any discussion around tax reform? It's a huge, in the US political season, the cycle, we see a lot of discussion about tax reform. You don't see a lot happening in India, or I'm missing it. So where do you think, what are the big reform areas when it comes to tax policy?
Just very quickly. Okay, and then, sure. Yeah.
go ahead.
No, just very, I think, in fact, perhaps I'm one of the few who's written on this at some length in India, in the Mint. So the two problems seem to be that tax revenues, tax collection is too low, but also the mix of taxes is the wrong mix.
Yeah.
that we have far too much reliance on indirect taxes, much more than would be optimal. So that mix has to be rectified. The problem is that if you see that as a formula to raise direct taxes, then I think perhaps it's may lead to the wrong outcome. So we have to fix the tax mix as well as the tax rate and the tax level.
It's not true that there's not. I mean, GST. That's the biggest tax, and what it will do is it will go towards this rebalancing that Vivek is talking about, because what you have is a proliferation of cascading inefficient taxes that will get replaced by this. So,
just a very quick comment on this, and it's absolutely crucial because of the role of indirect taxation. I'm not saying anyone's doing this. This is not a criticism, but as India tries to improve its tax capacity going forward, for the next 10 years, maybe even longer, you have to make sure indirect tax reform doesn't end up being an indirect tax on labor and on hiring. And it's an easy principle, I can say it. It's not easy to do when you rely on indirect taxation. It's not easy to figure out whether you're effectively discouraging hiring through an indirect tax. So there's a principle there that really desperately needs to be applied, and the implementation is actually quite challenging. So hopefully Vivek, the IMF, and others can focus on this, because I think that gets to the core of Indian development.
So I'm going to take a question from Twitter before coming back to the audience in the room. This is from Amitabh Chandra 2, at Amitabh Chandra 2. And here's the question. Why the emphasis on FDI when FDI doesn't appear to be a prerequisite for economic growth? Who wants to take it?
you can start with that.
Who's emphasizing FDI?
Well, we talked about
Modi. Okay, not us.
No. I think I think we'd all agree at this table that some sensible and pragmatic mix of domestic investment and foreign investment is going to be a must. And at some point, given that domestic investment in India has been falling and savings have been stagnant, FDI is the obvious way to fill the gap.
Yep. And everyone knows. I mean, whether or not it contributes to growth directly, FDI flows tend to be the most stable capital flows. Right. So if you're going to finance a deficit in your current account, I would prefer that it's done through FDI than more fickle capital. Flows.
Let's take one more from Twitter. This is from at Adi Andalikar, who asks, is the current focus on projects and infrastructure enough? Do you see enough long-term institution building focus? Milan, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that if you look ahead at the challenges, we mentioned the fiscal ones, the banks, this issue of nationalism. I think a fourth one is clearly the institutional challenge, right? I mean, I think you can get the right policy frameworks, and you've seen a lot of evolution in policy on a number of dimensions over the past quarter century. But one thing you haven't seen a lot of change in is kind of India's institutional foundations. And I do think that it's something that this government has underplayed in the first 2 years, and every government for the last many decades has underplayed. So if you look at, some of the best economic reforms that can be done actually have nothing to do in the first instance with the economy. They have to do with the judiciary. They have to do with the civil service. They have to do with the police. They have to do with the way in which people enter and exit government. And I think that's someplace where, if you think of this whole swathe of institutional administrative reforms, some of this can actually be done via the executive and doesn't require legislation. And so, I think there's a question of always priorities. But I think there is a time when we sort of worry about the bandwidth problems of the government, because there is so much authority vested within the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office that these sort of issues, which don't seem urgent necessarily, they're important but not urgent, get put on the back burner. And I would club this entire issue of administrative and institutional reforms in that category.
Just to add on infrastructure, it's true we didn't talk about it, and I'm wondering why we didn't. But it's not because it's not important, because it is very important. Just wanted to again give some credit to this government. Have they done enough? Maybe. I don't know what is enough, but obviously enough is when we have very good infrastructure. That's when it's enough. But
that will be a while.
That's true. But this government has done streamlining of the coal block auctioning, the financial restructuring of the state electricity boards. Again, unfortunately, they're done once and it came back. FDI in railway infrastructure. There have been some steps. The tax-free infrastructure bonds, I think, is another one. And finally, with something I mentioned earlier, which is moving towards market-based pricing of fuels and so on. You could say that all of them together constitute some boost for infrastructure, maybe not enough.
I would just add quickly, I mean, I think the increased capital expenditure we've seen in both this budget and the previous one, right, have served as a stimulus, and the idea that maybe you can somehow crowd private investment in. But I think there seems to be a realization in the government that that's not going to get us out of the domestic investment muddle we're in. We're actually going to more frontally have to take on the issue of highly over-leveraged companies on the infrastructure side and the banks. And I think that realization is now seems to be sinking in.
Back to the room, the lady at the table, right behind.
Thanks. Kim Elliott with the Center for Global Development, and I wanted to come back on the trade issue and just to kind of comment. I think one reason that the WTO is moribund is because India has taken such a recalcitrant position. So any chance that might change and you get a more India-friendly trade agreement if you do it multilaterally rather than joining onto the TPP. But I suspect the unilateral domestic reform side is more likely in the short run. So just a specific question on that. There's a sort of a window of opportunity with costs rising in China for the apparel sector, which has been a huge employer, especially of poor women and a lot of other developing countries. So one of the issues that I've heard raised that goes to trade policy reform as opposed to the logistics, which are also important, but is on the, cotton apparel is pretty, stable, stagnant, not really growing. It's in the man-made fibers, but India has high tariffs because of their domestic industry. So any chance that, as along with logistics and other things, that would be politically presumably easier, any chance that India would also take on some of these hard trade policy changes?
Just one sentence on this. I mean, Kim, I read your work with interest. Now, I mean, I'll just say on the first point that you raised, in Washington, they say that India sank, the WTO, and in Delhi, I hear the opposite, that it was, recalcitrance from the U.S. and the advanced. So I think it's a blame game. I mean, each side can blame the other. The reality is that it takes consensus at the WTO, and if you don't have it, you can blame whomever you want. But I do think the notion that somehow India is singularly responsible for the failure of the DDA or the Nairobi summit, I think is certainly unfair. I think that there's more than enough blame to be shared on that front.
Again, on this, I think I was at the same event as you, where Arvind Subramanian talked about the textile industry possibly being the next big job generator, both for people in India and particularly with the gender focus, with a female labor force participation focus. So yeah, I mean, that would be, I think, part of what, maybe I'm speaking for Milan, but I think that would be part of a strategy, right? Where you say, okay, this is an actual opportunity here. What do we need to make this, to realize the opportunity? And that, I think, would be great if they were actually to get that going. Not that there'll be many, many fundamental problems that have to be solved. So, which is why I asked Arvind that talk, why hasn't it happened yet,
Derek, why don't you take a stab at that too? In the meantime, if we can get the mic to the gentleman over there.
I think textiles are a great example. It's self-evident that the gains from unilateral liberalization on the Indian side from textiles would help economically, given demography, given cost structure, right? I mean, this is just an easy call on the economic side. And the bad thing about the trade discussion, and I'm guilty of it right here, is that instead we get caught up in India did this in the past. India has to be a different trading country than it was in the past. If it doesn't adjust to the fact that it is now the primary source of labor force growth in the world, then that's an incredible disservice to the Indian people. On the foreign side, we have to say, okay, 2008 was whatever. We have this view of 2008 in the Doha round. We need to respond to an India that changes. But the original change has to be with India. So we're going to have to get some sort of shift, along with India's development aspirations and its labor market changes, where India just becomes a different trading partner than it was. And then the world has to put aside, you made me mad a few years ago.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian Popper, Aiken Gump. Now I want to talk a little bit more about trade, but more U.S.-India trade specifically. So the U.S. business community has, for a number of years, had a variety of issues in India's trade regime. We've touched a little bit on intellectual property, but beyond just the pharmaceutical issues, the copyright. There's been forced localization measures. Obviously, India has now said it'll appeal the WTO loss on the solar dispute. Raising tariffs on ICT products. There's a variety of measures that the business community here in the United States has been pretty vocal about. And I guess the question is, what do you think about those issues? Is the U.S. business community right to raise those, or are there others that you think the business community is just missing and should really be focusing on for its own benefit?
Who are you addressing this to?
The panel, I guess.
I mean, you know my position. I can state it really quickly. I think what U.S. business should have a long-term view of India in the following sense, which is where U.S. business will gain astronomically is from an India that transforms in a pro-market direction. And so when the U.S. is pressing for particular bilateral issues, I think they're making a mistake, and I think they're making a mistake tactically. They're certainly making a mistake strategically. I think where U.S. business should serve as not a partner for India that India can do whatever it wants, but a partner for pro-market reform that isn't relationship specific. Mm-hmm. It gets the backup less, and it will pay off even more, even in the medium term. So if the American business community is focused on, boy, the Indian government did something that really annoyed me on pharma IP, I understand. But the gain for the business community as a whole, for umbrella organizations, should be to encourage pro-market reform in India wherever they can and not worry so much about irritants in the short term. Because irritants in the short term are going to pay off a little bit, and pro-market reform in India is going to pay off in a transformative fashion.
So I'm going to take one more from Twitter just because this person has a great handle. At After Single Malt wants to know, why is India's printed GDP doubted? Milan. You get the easy ones.
Oh, dear.
I think that's the answer.
I mean, I think look, I think many people outside and inside the government applaud the government for moving towards standards on GDP measurement that are closer to what international best practices are. I mean, I'm sitting next to the IMF. But I think there's a lot of confusion in the implementation of how they got from point A to point B. Right. And the reason that there is sort of an asterisk by that GDP number is because people look at they've recalculated the old series and see that the number is closer to 5.4% than 7.4%. And then they look at a bunch of high-frequency indicators, which tend to correlate in most countries with how the economy grows. And if you look at that, the correlation seems to be fairly weak. In other words, the high-frequency indicators on all sorts of demand are showing that the economy is not galloping ahead. It's, in fact, sort of at a plateau. And so I think that's the simple answer. I think nobody feels that there was malintent in how they did this. But in some way, from getting from point A to point B, there's a total disjuncture with a whole set of other real-time indicators.
Would you like?
Yes. So the IMF Statistics Department has gone and looked at the methodology, and the methodology is sound. So I think that's exactly as Milan says. It's how they handle the transition from one series to another, and I think the communications around it. The fact that high-frequency indicators often are dissonant with the measured GDP is, by the way, not true only for India. I think there's tons of countries, including one that I'm currently working on, an advanced country, Japan, where you see, not only dissonance between high-frequency indicators and the data that come out, but huge revisions that take place month after, quarter after quarter. So what can I say? It's a tough field.
Very quickly.
Just one word. I mean, this is one of these things where this was the best intentioned reform, moving to global best practice, not a product of the BJP at all. It just so happened that this new series kicked in when they came to power. But the timing was unfortunate because this raised this question mark. I think over time it'll settle down and we'll get a sense of, how well this actually tallies.
Well, I think we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask one last question, and I want to take advantage of this to put all of you on the spot. Yes or no answer. Is Narendra Modi an economic reformer? Start, Derek.
No, he's a business reformer.
Yes. He's a modernizer who therefore will reform the economy.
What is that?
What they said.
What all three of them said.
Drop out.
I'm the least able to speak in my institutional hat.
Well, I think
so.
people can read into those silences. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming over here, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
That was fun.